So I'm going to take about 10, 15 minutes to run through a bit of an overview of what we think is happening in the world of digital production printing. And as you all know, this has really been hard infrastructure reset. The world as we know it, in terms of how people buy print, what they do with print, and all the business models associated with print procurement are going to change dramatically as we come out of this. So I'll give you a little background. So before the coronavirus hit, we already were witnessing a market that was in decline, particularly for offset print. So this chart on the left shows you offset and digital print together for document pages, which are things like transaction pages, direct mail, book printing, and publishing pages, which would include book and magazines and catalogs and newspapers and the like. So anyway, the volumes were coming down. Of course, that was all declining on the offset side. Digital pages were growing, but they were a relatively small part of that. And if you look at the overall decline in the last 10 years, we were averaging about 6.9% of page loss a year. That is a big number, by the way, because that means that over the last 10 years, we've lost something like 70% of those pages. Now, it's a little bit skewed because a lot of that was tied to newsprint. But if you look at the value side of things, what you'll see is that the retail expenditures were also coming down, but not quite as much as the actual offset print volumes. So we're looking at a decline of about 4.4% for retail expenditures. And what that really tells you is that the value of these pages is actually coming back up. And it's coming back up because we're seeing a gradual shift towards digital printing. And a digitally printed page is worth something like 5 to 10 times more than an offset printed page to the people who buy it. So that's the good news. So if you're on the digital print side, long-term, the outlook is quite good. Now, what does this all mean? So one of the things that's happened is in these digital pages, the big breakthrough in technology came from continuous feed inkjet. Digital printing has been around for 30, 40 years, but until continuous feed inkjet technology was introduced in 2008, we weren't able to get through the volume, the productivity. And so if you look at that market today, you say, wow, it doesn't look so great either, right? We're projecting a decline of something like 70% in new hardware sales in 2020 as a result of the coronavirus. But you have to look at both the other side of the coin, which is the install base, which continues to grow because the average life of these inkjet presses now, we believe, is probably somewhere between 15 to maybe even as long as 20 years because of the upgradability. And what that really does is if you look at the page volumes, look at that incredible growth. And it's really an exponential growth rate. So continuous feed inkjet is extremely important. Yes, we have a reset. And in fact, we're projecting at IT Strategies that this pandemic effectively puts us back maybe about 2 years in terms of where page volumes were. However, note that by 2024, we think we'll be right back on track. And in fact, that may even be conservative because there's a number of things happening in this industry that are allowing inkjet technology to address a whole new group of applications. And so the big breakthrough in this was what we're calling the ability to print on coated glossy offset papers. So there's a whole series of new technologies available that can effectively print at the quality levels of offset on the papers that offset printers are used to at volumes that just weren't possible with digital color presses and the likes. So big breakthrough. This might grow even faster than we've projected. So that's all good news. The bad news in this is that the world of how we print is changing, right? So we're getting a lot more jobs. Many of these jobs are shorter in runs. And all of a sudden, we're also experiencing tighter service level agreement deadlines, right? People want things faster. We live in an Amazon world. And so we saw that trend happening for a long time. But I think what will happen is as we get out of this post-corona situation, all of that is going to accelerate. And people are going to order just what they want, when they want it. And the days of buying things for the lowest cost per thousand, they're going to disappear. So dealing with all these complexities of higher frequency and shorter runs is a real battle between we need to automate things, but we need flexibility. And on top of that, people want accountability. So we've solved that for years through what I call the superheroes, right? That's your staff inside the printing plant that goes the extra miles to keep everything running with the legacy infrastructure that's out there. But the problem is, as you get into higher frequencies and more jobs, basically you can't keep track of this stuff anymore. You've got to automate it on the workflow software side. You've got to automate it on the track and trace side. And that all ties back to accountability, because just like today, when you order something on Amazon, you can see exactly where that package is and when it will be delivered. That's what people are going to expect from the print industry as well. So 1 to 2 day delivery deadlines, I think, are going to become the norm as we come out of this. So what do we do about all this? There's another little problem before we get to that, and that is the demographics. So before the coronavirus, this is a complicated chart, but it basically shows US births from the early 1900s through 2018. And what happened is you see a little dip over here, which started in 2008. During that last economic recession, we saw about 500,000 fewer births between 2008 and 2018. What that means is that starting in 2026, when those first babies born in 2008 will start to enter the workforce, basically, it's not just the print industry that's going to have a lot less labor. It's the entire economic industry or economic world in the US and overseas as well that's going to have fewer workers. So the labor wages are going to skyrocket. So another point why we need to automate. And we have projected before the coronavirus that 2026 would be the beginning of a tipping point where we shift from offset print to digital print. That's now going to accelerate as a result of that pandemic, and we're going to start seeing that happen early. So from a business model, what does that all mean? If you look back in the day, in the past, when you had a typical print job, you'd spend a certain amount of time on order entry, data management, pre-press, printing, and finishing. And printing and finishing really accounted for the majority of the labor that went into it. But what I've just told you is that if you look at where we are today, it's going to get a lot more difficult to find labor. It's already a problem. It's going to become a much bigger problem. So we have to shift where we put the emphasis on the value of print. So we've got to automate the printing and finishing process, and that's happening now. But where we really need to invest is higher value labor for data management. Basically, that's the piece where we take the content that people want printed and we ratchet up the value that content is going to deliver. And some of that will be on the basis of variable data. Some of it will be on micro runs. Some of it will be tied to just-in-time delivery within 24 hours. But all of that is going to require a lot more emphasis on data rather than emphasis on finding the next operator in the bindery department whose wages are skyrocketing. So in the end, our focus in the world of print has to shift from the lowest cost per piece to generating high value. Because yes, there'll be a lot less print coming out of this market in the future, but what's left is going to be of much higher value. And so correspondingly, you've got to invest in the software to drive that. What does that all mean? A few things. First of all, the business models, as I mentioned before, for the lowest cost per thousand are going to disappear. And you've got to be able to track and trace things much more accurately because that's what your customers are going to expect. Again, it's that infrastructure shift. And what that will allow you to do is that as you invest in truly understanding your workflow, your cost, your flow through the entire system, what that's going to allow you to do is get a much better understanding of your true cost of printing. We go into commercial printers all the time and we say, so how much time did it take to do this job? And they'll give you an answer. And then when they go back and check their records, it turns out that it actually took twice as long as what they had expected. And they had a gut feel, but that gut feel turned out to be off because the frequency of jobs is just skyrocketing. And all these superheroes are basically covering, right, for that deficiency. So as we get better at tracking and tracing things and truly understanding our cost, we'll also be able to price things more dynamically. And while this is a really bad example at this moment in time, I think what will happen over time is the print industry is going to look more like how the airline industry prices things. It's going to be based on supply and demand. And if you have a really good understanding of what your true costs are, you're going to be able to price things far better in terms of margin than you're able to do today because you're basically flying blind. So the need to invest in that workflow software, the track and trace software, it's absolutely imperative if you're going to thrive as we come out of this post-corona pandemic. Bottom line, yes, labor is going to become a problem. We know it's a problem. Automation is going to become a requirement. and we have to plan for that. As you plan for this, don't forget to plan for investments in workflow software, because that's going to be the key. It's not about having the next new beautiful shiny press. It's about understanding your costs. These new business models that are going to come out are really focused on these micro runs and these ultra short runs. And that is going to displace offset. We want instant response, low friction. What that means is I don't want to call you to find out where my print job is. I want to see on a dashboard exactly where it is without having to call you, because calling you is going to take me 10 minutes. If I look at the dashboard, that gives me a 1-minute answer. So all of these things are going to become really critical to survival. As I mentioned before, we've got to track this thing. If we don't track it and we don't price our jobs accordingly, you're not going to survive. The companies who basically, run their businesses on having the largest economies of scale possible at the lowest cost, those are the ones that are going to get hit very hard, I think. And last, production inkjet, and I'm slightly biased because I love inkjet, but it's going to be really important to enable this transition. So that new technology on the hardware side, plus the hardware or the software technology on running a business together, these things are going to bring great new profits to this world. And once we get past this pandemic, I think the world for digital printing past 2024 is going to look better than we've ever seen. Of course, it's never simple, right? So the OEMs recognize, based upon their requests from their customers, that they have to start offering this software. The challenge that they face is they could probably get to a certain level for their own equipment, but it won't necessarily connect to other equipment that's in some customer's plant. So in the end, what happens more often than not is we default back to specialists. And this is not meant to be an advertisement for Ironsides, but of course, you're one of those specialists. I'm pretty confident that you work very closely with a lot of these OEMs to synchronize the ability to track and trace, not just on that one vendor's equipment, but also on things like the inserters, the bindery parts. Because again, it's not just about tracking the job, figuring out what the cost is on the press. It's being able to track the entire process from beginning to end and knowing exactly that the cost in the bindery, it turns out, was twice as much as I thought. And so it's very difficult for the OEMs to be able to do that themselves beyond the press itself. So that's why the relevancy of independent software providers remains incredibly strong. And I think it will always be that way.